By the first days of June 1944, the Allied invasion of France was balanced on something as fragile as the sky over the English Channel. More than 1 million men were in motion. Thousands of ships were packed and ready. Airborne divisions were sealed off in their camps, and Eisenhower's headquarters at Southwick House felt like a building holding its breath. Every map was pinned, every timetable hammered down to the minute, every landing craft assigned to some beach or sea lane. The only thing nobody could lock down was the weather. It sounds almost ridiculous now, given the scale of the operation, but the whole invasion came down to a kind of atmospheric coin toss. And Eisenhower, a man famous for calmness, found himself staring at the one variable he couldn't command. He had planned a war across continents, but he couldn't order the Atlantic to behave. The situation was worse than people picture today. The meteorology teams, British and American groups who didn't always agree, were tracking the ragged edge of North Atlantic Depression rolling in hard from the west. By June 1st, the forecasts were already sour. Thick cloud ceilings, rough seas, high winds, and the kind of murky air that blinded bombers and made paratroopers scatter into the dark like spilled marbles. Conditions over the channel had started to collapse, and the whole invasion window for June 5th looked like it was sliding out of reach. Eisenhower listened, not because he wanted to, but because the weather left him no choice. If the seas pitched too high, the landing craft would broach or flip. Too much cloud meant the airborne pathfinders couldn't see their drop zones. And if the winds got much worse, the whole invasion risked becoming a very expensive drowning. The commanders gathered around the long table at Southwick, looking like men stuck between conviction and dread. Montgomery insisted they had to go at the first possible moment, weather be damned. Lee Mallory, who always seemed to imagine paratroopers suffering worst, argued the airborne drops would be slaughtered in bad conditions. Admiral Ramsey hated the idea of committing his landing craft in anything rougher than moderate seas. Air Chief Marshal Tedder pushed for delay, and Eisenhower sat there in the middle, a man carrying all their contradictions. What makes this moment so striking is how human it was. These weren't grand marble statue figures. They were tired men who had been living on tension for months. Eisenhower smoked constantly, pacing, listening to the meteorologists like they were reading omens. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Trucks rolled through the dark roads outside the estate, moving gear toward embarkation ports while everyone waited for a decision no one wanted to make. On the morning of June 4th, the forecast slammed the door shut. No go. Eisenhower postponed the operation for 24 hours. That alone was dangerous. Hundreds of ships were already at sea. Troops were locked into their embarkation zones with no room to move. You don't just pause a cross-channel invasion like you'd postpone a meeting. Every hour of delay meant more strain on secrecy, coordination, fuel, even food. If they delayed too long, they'd have to stand the entire invasion down, and that meant weeks of reorganization. More time for the Germans to guess what was coming. Eisenhower knew it. That's why he looked as if the weight of the entire Western world was sitting on his shoulders, because it was. Through that miserable June 4th evening, the wind grew stronger. Low clouds scraped over the channel, and the barometer kept falling. Eisenhower stared out from Southwick House toward the southern horizon as if he could personally bully the storm into leaving. The meteorologists argued among themselves. Their data was crude compared to what we have now. No satellites, limited radar, nothing except a handful of ships and weather stations giving patchy readings. Forecasting the weather in the English Channel was basically a controlled gamble. Then came the break. Just before midnight and into the early hours of June 5th, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist and a man who carried his own burden, walked into Eisenhower's conference room with something like cautious hope. The Atlantic system, he explained, was shifting. A brief window, just a small one, looked likely to open on June 6. It wouldn't be perfect. The seas would still be rough, clouds would linger, and the winds might still howl harder than anyone liked. But it wasn't impossible. Stagg's voice was calm, measured. He wasn't trying to sell optimism. He was describing a crack in the door. To Eisenhower, that crack mattered. The room's mood flipped into a tense, buzzing sort of debate. Everyone had an opinion. Ramsey thought the window was feasible. Montgomery wanted to go. Lee Mallory still insisted the airborne would suffer catastrophic losses. Tedder urged caution again. Around the table, the arguments rose and fell, paced by the rain hammering outside and the faint rumble of wind. But ultimately, none of these men had the authority to pull the trigger. Only Eisenhower did. He looked at Stagg, not for reassurance, but for clarity. The forecaster confirmed the conditions. A narrow improvement, not long-lasting, but real enough to give a fighting chance. That was all Eisenhower needed. He didn't make some dramatic declaration. He didn't stand up or pound the table. He simply leaned forward, hands clasped, shoulders tight, and said almost quietly, "Okay, let's go." Just like that. 4 simple words that committed the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 4 simple words that sent thousands of ships across the channel, unleashed airborne divisions into the night, and opened the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The men around the table exhaled as if they'd been holding their lungs frozen. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted, like the moment before a show begins, when the decision is made and all that's left is performance. Outside Southwick House, staff officers began transmitting coded messages across secure lines. Embarkation signals went out. Somewhere in an airfield to the north, a paratrooper smoked a last cigarette beside his barracks, while ground crews checked the engines on C-47s lined in rows across the tarmac. On the south coast, infantrymen in their assault jackets waited in the belly of landing craft, trying to guess whether they'd be crossing today or tomorrow. Sailors tightened lines, pilots checked maps, and commanders ran through their operations orders for the 1,000th time, all because of one weather call. And the truth is, no one knew if Eisenhower had chosen salvation or catastrophe. In the hours after Eisenhower gave the word, the whole southern coast of England seemed to wake up. Not with noise exactly, but with movement. Quiet, disciplined, relentless movement. If you'd been standing on the cliffs above Portland or looking down from a hedgerow near Portsmouth, you'd have seen ships shifting in the gray dawn, columns of vehicles rolling toward piers, signal lamps blinking between vessels like fireflies speaking code. Most of the men involved didn't know anything about the weather gamble. They weren't aware that only a few hours earlier the invasion had still been a coin toss. They knew the seas were rough and the sky was ugly, but the higher-level decision-making was far above their job. Soldiers tend to experience history as orders, not debates. So when the green lights came, they moved. The channel that morning was moody, low clouds stretching like wool, winds kicking up stiff waves, white caps snapping against steel hulls. The meteorologists had been right. Conditions weren't good. They were just barely acceptable. Anyone who had ever spent time at sea could feel it in their bones. The bigger ships could handle the motion, but the smaller landing craft were already bouncing around like tin toys in a bathtub. Several sailors joked darkly that if the Germans didn't kill them, seasickness might. Airfields across southern England buzzed as ground crews prepped transport planes and gliders. The airborne divisions, the American 82nd and 101st, the British 6th, went through their familiar ritual. Rifles checked, parachutes inspected, gear tightened, faces smeared with charcoal. Nobody looked relaxed. Veterans from Sicily and Italy knew what night drops behind enemy lines felt like. The newer guys hid their nerves behind humor that was too loud, and overhead, the sky offered no comfort. Thick cloud layers hung low, turbulent, unsteady. Pilots glanced up at it and exchanged looks that said, "It's going to be rough up there." Back at Southwick House, Eisenhower tried to project calm, but the weight gnawed at him. Once he gave the order, most of the operation was out of his hands. He paced the halls, checked reports, smoked one cigarette after another, and occasionally stepped outside into the wet June air as if he could read the weather from the wind alone. James Stagg stayed close by, continuing to monitor the storm system. The forecaster wasn't relaxed either. If his prediction turned out to be wrong, if the window failed to appear or slammed shut, the consequences would be unthinkable. He wasn't gambling with his reputation. He was gambling with the lives of 150,000 men. The pressure was absurd. Even his assistants noticed how pale he looked, like someone aging by the hour. Meanwhile, deep inside France, the Germans were peering at the same sky, but interpreting it very differently. To them, the worsening conditions meant the Allies wouldn't try anything. Most of the German command expected the invasion to come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy, and certainly not during bad weather. Rommel himself had left his post to visit his wife for her birthday. Senior officers were scattered. Many believed the Allies wouldn't attempt anything until the storms cleared, and the forecast called for several more days of rough seas and poor visibility. That misreading became one of the biggest strokes of luck the Allies ever received. The Channel storm, the very thing that nearly canceled the invasion, also lulled the Germans into a sense of timing that was completely wrong. That small break on June 6 was something only the Allied meteorologists caught, a quirk in the movement of Atlantic air pressure that the German Weather Service never saw. And that difference in forecasting might have been worth an entire army. By late afternoon on June 5th, the first waves of airborne troops began boarding their transports. C-47 engines growled as they warmed up, filling the airfield with a smell of exhaust and tension. Pilots walked around their planes, running hands along metal seams, inspecting propellers, checking fuel. They were heading into a night that promised clouds, turbulence, and German flak waiting on the other side. Inside the planes, paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder in dim light, equipment hanging off them like metal fruit. Some prayed, some joked, some stared straight ahead, lost in their own thoughts. They knew the basics: drop zones, rendezvous points, objectives. Blow the bridges, seize the causeways, take the high ground behind the beaches. But they also knew airborne drops rarely went according to plan. Darkness and weather could scatter them far off target, and with the forecast the way it was, that seemed almost guaranteed. The glider troops, waiting nearby, had an even grimmer view of what was coming. Riding a plywood glider into combat was like being launched across the night in a fragile coffin. Every man who'd done it before remembered the landings as violent, bone-rattling affairs. Trees, hedgerows, ditches, none of it was forgiving. And on top of that, wind gusts were still strong enough to make even experienced glider pilots nervous. But none of that stopped the preparations. Just before dusk, the first transport planes rumbled down the runways and lifted into the sky. It was still daylight, but the cloud ceiling made everything feel dimmer than it should have been, as if the world were shifting into twilight early. Eisenhower watched some of those planes take off from a nearby airfield. Later, he'd say that moment weighed more heavily on him than almost anything else he'd done in the war. Once those men were airborne, there was no turning them around. The die was well and truly cast. As the night deepened, the entire southern coast throbbed with engines. Ships departed in steady lines, slipping through choppy water, destroyers breaking waves at their bows, landing craft bouncing behind them like stubborn animals on a leash. Navigation lights were masked. Only the faintest glimmer showed. Radar screens glowed inside steel compartments while officers murmured orders. The weather wasn't kind. Rain blew sideways over decks. Wind gusts knifed across the water. Several smaller craft had to slow down to keep from swamping. More than a few men leaned over rails, losing their stomachs to the sea. But the armada kept moving, held together by years of planning and the simple momentum of orders already in motion. Somewhere above that dark sea, the first airborne paths were forming, a long, fragile chain of aircraft heading toward the Cotentin Peninsula and the fields behind Sword Beach. They flew into cloud almost immediately. The turbulence hit like a series of punches. Paratroopers gripped the webbing straps above their heads. Pilots fought the controls. Navigators squinted at instruments, trying to stay on course while the planes buffeted up and down. And yet, despite the rough ride, the operation continued. Back at Southwick House, the staff tracked it all. Eisenhower stepped into the map room again and again, restless, asking for updates that nobody could fully provide yet. Once an invasion is launched, information dries up. Planes vanish into the dark, ships vanish into the haze of the channel, and silence takes over. You wait. You hope. You trust that the choices you made hours earlier, based on a fragile weather window, weren't a mistake. For Eisenhower, this was the real agony. He couldn't steer a ship or fly a plane or redirect the storm above them. All he could do was watch the barometer, listen to Stagg's updates, and wait for dawn. And dawn, on June 6th, was getting closer by the minute. In the early hours of June 6th, the sky over the channel was a restless gray. Clouds layered in messy formations, the kind that seemed to shift shape every few minutes. There was no sunrise in the classic sense. Light just slowly seeped into the world, like someone lifting a dimmer switch on a stormy day. The sea was still rough, wind still blowing sharp, but Stagg's promised window was holding, at least for now. Far ahead of the invasion fleet, hundreds of aircraft, C-47s, gliders, Pathfinder planes, were fighting their way across the coast of France. For the paratroopers inside, the jump was a violent, chaotic introduction to the war they were about to enter. Most of the drop zones were socked in with cloud. Some Pathfinder beacons failed. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from villages, towns, and even isolated farmhouses. The moment the first bursts of German flak lit the night, any hope of a clean, perfect airborne drop vanished. Pilots dodged tracer fire, sometimes too sharply. Some overshot the drop areas entirely. Others released men too early or too late, 20, 30, 50 miles away from where they were supposed to land. Paratroopers spilled out into the dark like grains from a torn bag. Many of them crashed through treetops, slammed into hedgerows, or plunged into flooded fields that swallowed men whole. Gear tangled, rovers lost their squads, radios were scattered everywhere. The countryside became a maze of hedges and ditches filled with confused groups of Americans and British trying to reorient themselves while German patrols prowled nearby. And yet, this is the strange beauty of that night. The chaos worked in the Allies' favor. German commanders couldn't make sense of the reports coming in. With paratroopers landing all over the place, it looked like the Allies had dropped entire armies across Normandy. Units that should have concentrated to repel the beach landings instead diverted in every direction, chasing shadows and gunshots echoing from unexpected pockets of resistance. Eisenhower wouldn't know any of that until hours later. At that moment, he was back at Southwick House with barely any updates, just fragments. A report of planes over the Cotentin, radio silence from the gliders, a vague message from one of the airborne command posts. Nothing conclusive. The tension around the map table was thick enough to feel in your teeth. The naval situation wasn't much clearer. The armada stretched across the channel in long columns, destroyers trying to keep station while the smaller craft slammed into waves that came at them in irregular, unpredictable rhythms. Many landing craft crews had to throttle back to keep from taking water over the bow. Men inside were soaked, freezing, and already exhausted before they had even seen the coast of France. But the invasion was still on track. By around 4:30 a.m., the first shapes of France came into view. Dark bluffs, low hills, and faint outlines of villages. The naval bombardment groups moved closer. Battleships and cruisers rolled in the swells like massive, patient beasts. Officers double-checked their firing coordinates. Men stood ready at the guns, and every pair of eyes pointed toward the shoreline. Inside those ships, you could feel the tension. The whole war seemed to compress into those final minutes before the order to open fire. Then it came, short, crisp, almost anticlimactic. Commence firing. The battleships answered first. Massive shells roared over the waves, leaving long, angry trails of smoke, the sound reaching the men in landing craft seconds later like thunder arriving late to its own storm. Cruisers and destroyers followed, peppering the coast, aiming at bunkers, gun positions, suspected strongpoints, anything that looked like it might shoot back. Far down the coast, British ships were pounding the approaches to Sword and Gold. To the west, Americans lined up off Omaha and Utah. The whole shoreline lit with explosions, flashes, smoke drifting in heavy curtains across villages and cliffs. For the men approaching the beaches, the bombardment was both reassuring and terrifying. Comforting because it meant the war had clearly begun. Frightening because even the heaviest naval guns couldn't guarantee the defenses would be broken. Aboard his headquarters ship, Admiral Ramsey monitored it all with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the operation 1,000 times. Every ship had a job, every lane was plotted, every sequence synchronized. The rough seas strained that choreography, but they didn't break it. Still, Eisenhower wasn't watching. He had decided he wouldn't cross the channel that day. He stayed where his staff could reach him and where he could process incoming reports. But the waiting was its own kind of torment. Those around him said he looked like he was aging by the minute, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the large operational map as though he could will the pieces into the right places. Every now and then he asked Stagg about the weather window, whether it would hold or slam shut before the afternoon landings finished. Stagg gave the same answer each time. The window was real, but it was narrow, and the system could shift again by evening. That meant the Allies had to succeed fast. If the weather worsened too soon, follow-up waves could be delayed or scattered, leaving the first landing forces isolated. All of this hung over the morning like a shadow. Meanwhile, the airborne troops, scattered but determined, were beginning to rally. A small group from the 101st seized the causeway at Poupeville. Elements of the 82nd fought their way towards Saint-Mère-Église, where a handful of paratroopers had dropped right into the town square under fire. British glider teams captured the bridges over the Seine Canal with a precision landing that would become one of the most famous coups of the entire war. The scattered drops made the German response fragmented. Some German units reported hundreds of paratroopers where there were only a few dozen. Others heard nothing at all. Radios clogged with contradictory messages. Commanders hesitated, trying to understand what the Allies were really aiming for. That hesitation mattered, because just after 6 a.m., the landing craft were lining up for their final run toward the beaches. Engines revved, ramps rattled, officers shouted over the sea spray. The coastline came into view through the morning mist. Cliffs, dunes, farmhouses, concrete bunkers that looked small at a distance but would soon tower over the men heading straight toward them. The closer they got, the more every soldier felt the truth. This was the point of no return. Behind them, destroyers fired their last salvos, throwing up fountains of smoke and debris along the shoreline. Ahead of them, machine gun nests waited. Mines waited. Barbed wire waited. The narrow weather window was still open, but only just. And Eisenhower, pacing at Southwick House, didn't know yet whether he had sent these men into a narrow gap or into a trap. He would find out soon. Everyone would. But first, the ramps had to drop. The ramps dropped into water that wasn't calm at all. Waves slapped the fronts of the landing craft and surged inside as the men pushed forward, rifles held above their heads, packs dragging them down. The air smelled like cordite and salt and diesel. It was loud and strangely quiet at the same time. Loud because of gunfire and explosions. Quiet because every soldier was locked inside his own fear and focus. Omaha was the worst of it. Everyone knows that now, but the men approaching it at dawn didn't. They only knew the cliffs looked taller than the reconnaissance photos. They saw the smoke hanging low over the beach. They heard the ping of machine gun fire skipping off the water and the dull punch of artillery from somewhere they couldn't see. The weather didn't help. The rough seas had thrown off the timing. Many amphibious tanks launched too far out and sank with their crews still inside. Several units drifted sideways and landed in the wrong sectors. Engineers carrying explosives to clear gaps in the wire were scattered all along the surf. Leadership was fragmented in minutes. And the Germans on those bluffs were very much alive and very much ready. On the decks of destroyers offshore, captains watched Omaha unravel. They saw men pinned down and landing craft stuck in patterns that weren't part of any plan. Some destroyer commanders pushed dangerously close toward the shoreline. They fired at point-blank range, trying to knock out anything shooting at the men below. The wind and waves made aiming difficult. Every broadside felt rushed. But without that fire support, Omaha might have dissolved completely. Other beaches saw mixed fortunes. Utah was almost surreal in its luck. Currents pushed the first wave off course, and they landed about a mile south of where they were supposed to be. General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. just looked around, assessed the situation, and declared they'd start the war from here instead. German defenses were thinner in that sector. The airborne troops nearby, scattered or not, created enough confusion to give the landing parties room to move inland. Further east, the British and Canadians hit their own storm of problems. Gold, Juno, Sword. Each had its own character. German strongpoints that refused to go quiet, tanks bogged in soft sand, narrow lanes jammed with wire and mines, but the momentum held. By mid-morning, units were pushing off the beaches. Not everywhere, not smoothly, but enough. Back in England, Eisenhower watched the clock like an adversary. Every minute that passed was another minute without clear news. The weather window was still open. Stagg confirmed it again. Clouds drifting but stable, winds easing just a little, enough for continued landings, enough for the afternoon waves, but nobody knew how long it would last. The storm system still churned out in the Atlantic. Its path remained unpredictable. If it shifted too fast, the channel could shut down again by nightfall. Messages trickled in slowly. A coded signal from Utah, a short update from British Command, a report that airborne units were fighting in St. Mary Glees. Nothing detailed, nothing that tied the day together. It was like trying to understand a battle by listening to mismatched echoes. Eisenhower forced himself to step away from the map room and take a short walk. Staff officers watched him go, hands clasped behind his back, head down, the morning light catching the lines in his face. He wasn't thinking about glory. He wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about whether he had sent thousands of young men to their deaths because he trusted a narrow break in the clouds. He had made difficult calls before. He would make more. But this one felt personal. It carried the weight of every family who had a son on one of those beaches. Every soldier who had trained for months for this one day. Every sailor guiding a landing craft. Every pilot who had flown through cloud and flak the night before. He paused near a patch of lawn where the hedges shielded the wind. Officers nearby pretended not to watch him. They knew that whatever happened on the French coast, Eisenhower had taken responsibility for it. He always had. That was his way. But it didn't make the waiting easier. At sea, the second wave was already forming. More infantry, more tanks, more engineers. If the wind picked up again, if the seas grew rougher, some of these craft wouldn't make the crossing easily. A few might have to turn back, but the operation's momentum was building. Once the Allies seized enough of the beachhead, more ships could unload supplies and equipment. The foothold would gain strength with every hour. On the beaches, the stories varied wildly. At Omaha, officers rallied small mixed groups of men. It didn't matter what unit they were from. Someone shouted for a push up the shingle. Someone else lobbed a grenade at a bunker slit. Engineers crawled forward with satchel charges. Riflemen fired at anything that looked like muzzle flash or movement. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. The rough weather had forced many German gunners to keep their heads down earlier. Some of their viewports fogged from the damp air. Some communication lines malfunctioned. A few strong points had taken hits from naval shells that landed just close enough to shake their crews. It wasn't much, but it made a difference. Around mid-morning, Eisenhower finally received a message that confirmed at least one beachhead was secure enough to bring more forces ashore. It wasn't a full victory. It wasn't the complete picture, but it was a lifeline. He didn't smile exactly. Those who saw him said his shoulders dropped just a little, like a man who had been holding tension in his spine for hours and allowed a fraction of it to release. But he didn't celebrate. He knew the hardest fighting was still ahead. Beaches were only the beginning. The hedgerow country behind them would turn into one of the most brutal battlegrounds of the entire war. Still, that first confirmation meant the gamble hadn't collapsed. The narrow weather break was holding long enough for the landings to take root. Back on the cliffs of Normandy, smoke drifted in heavy sheets. The tide pulled at debris floating near the shoreline. Paratroopers moved through fields that smelled of wet earth and gunpowder. Sailors unloaded crates of ammunition onto makeshift piers made from wrecked landing craft. Officers crouched in sand, studying maps softened by the damp air. And above all of them, the sky continued its fragile act. Clouds shifting, light filtering through in broken patches, wind easing and then rising again, a temporary truce in a storm that wanted to return. The invasion wasn't won yet, not even close, but it was alive. The weather had given them a chance. Eisenhower had taken it. Now it was up to the men on the ground to turn that chance into victory. By midday on June 6th, the reports started to thicken. Not good news, not bad news, just the truth finally arriving in pieces big enough to understand. The Allies were ashore. Bloodied in some places, ahead of schedule in others, scattered, exhausted, but moving. And once momentum takes hold in an operation that size, it becomes its own kind of force. At Southwick House, Eisenhower gathered around the update boards with his planners. The air was tense, but it wasn't the hollow tension of uncertainty anymore. It was the tight focus of a job still unfolding. Officers pinned new markers onto the large wall maps, airborne pockets linking up, beachheads widening, units pushing toward key junctions. Communications were still messy, but the outline of success was there. Not clean, not easy, but real. He stepped outside again around early afternoon. The clouds still hung low, moving in layers like torn fabric. Stagg joined him, quietly, almost hesitantly. The forecaster explained that the narrow window was going to close soon, that the storm system was repositioning, that the seas might worsen again, that planes scheduled for later waves would have a harder time. But the critical opening had held exactly when it needed to. Eisenhower nodded. He didn't blame Stagg for the danger that remained. He understood that weather didn't care about strategy or timetables. It didn't care about wars. All you could do was read it carefully and take your shot. And he had. Down on the beaches, the fight was turning in the Allies' favor. At Omaha, the men who had been pinned down for hours were now climbing the bluffs. Small squads led by sergeants and lieutenants found weak points in the German defenses, gaps between strong points, folds in the terrain, drainage ditches that offered a thin ribbon of cover. With grit and luck, they pushed through. On Utah, armor rolled inland, linking with the airborne pockets. The causeways were secured. German counterattacks were scattered and uncoordinated, still confused by the chaos of the night drops. The British at Gold were pushing toward Bayou. The Canadians at Juneau were fighting through stubborn resistance but opening the road towards Seine. And on Sword, a corridor inland was forming, shaky at first, but growing. The weather, unpredictable as ever, began to shift again by mid-afternoon. Winds rose, waves roughened, clouds thickened. A few follow-up waves struggled with the crossing. Some landing craft were delayed. Heavy equipment still offshore had to wait until conditions settled. But it didn't matter as much now. Enough men were ashore to hold a line. Enough machine guns were in place. Enough armor had rolled onto dry land. The foothold was secure, and that changed everything. Eisenhower finally received a fuller set of reports by late afternoon. Not from every commander. Some units were still too deep in the fight for proper communication, but from enough of them to paint a picture. Normandy hadn't been taken in a single sweep. There was no perfect execution, no clean, cinematic victory. It was messy and brutal and held together by improvisation, courage, stubbornness, and the steady pressure of thousands of men refusing to give up ground inch by inch. But it had worked. That evening, Eisenhower walked into a smaller room off the main operations area. He sat down heavily, not dramatically, just like a man who had been running on adrenaline and decision-making for far too long. Someone asked him if he wanted food. He said no. Someone else brought him coffee anyway. He sipped it without comment. For the first time in 2 days, he allowed himself to breathe with something like relief. He knew the battle for France was just beginning. He knew the coming weeks would be hell. Hedgerow fighting, German counterattacks, supply bottlenecks, weather storms still brewing out in the Atlantic. But he also knew something else. The Allies were on the continent. That fact was immovable now. The Channel could rage, storms could roll in, the Germans could counterattack, but the beachheads were dug in. The foothold was real. The beginning of the end was finally in motion. It's easy, looking back, to forget how thin the line was, how close the invasion came to unraveling before it even began, how the entire operation sat balanced on the fragile reed of one weather system the Germans never saw. Eisenhower didn't forget. Weeks later, when Stagg returned to London for additional forecasting work, Eisenhower sent him a quiet message of thanks. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of note a commander writes to someone whose judgment he trusted more than he let on. Stagg kept it for the rest of his life. But the deeper truth is this: the decision had never belonged to the weather alone. It belonged to Eisenhower. He was the one who had to weigh incomplete forecasts, human lives, and the risk of a catastrophic failure. He was the one who had to stare down uncertainty and choose a moment that might save the war or sink it under the waves. The gamble worked because he dared to make it. Years later, when people asked him about that night at Southwick House, about the pacing, the cigarettes, the silence, the burden, he said something simple, something almost too calm for the gravity of the moment. There was no alternative. But of course, there had been. He could have delayed. He could have waited for perfect weather. He could have postponed and risked German reinforcements, greater defenses, a shattered timetable, and a blow to Allied momentum they might never recover from. Instead, he chose the narrow, messy window, the real one. In the end, the story of D-Day isn't just beaches or paratroopers or tanks or ships. It's also the story of a single decision made in a quiet room while the sky outside was still angry and uncertain. A decision that pushed history forward because a commander was willing to trust a small sliver of opportunity in a sea of risk. When the world remembers June 6, it remembers the heroes on the beaches, the men in the air, the sailors at the helm. Rightly so. But in the background, behind the scenes, there's also that moment, past midnight in a stormy English estate, when Eisenhower leaned forward, listened to the weather he couldn't control, and made the call anyway. Okay, let's go. And because of that, Europe woke up to liberation. The gamble didn't just save D-Day, it saved everything that followed.